We live in a world where game publishing and development constantly push toward unexplored and uncomfortable territory. Lines are blurred between product and service, consumer, investor, and publisher. This wild west of game development lends itself to quite the contrast of stories, from crowdfunded games failing to deliver on expensive promises, to genres nearly single-handedly resurrected by passion-fueled Kickstarter projects that result both in commercial success and Game of the Year material. Enter EVERSPACE, a roguelike pseudo-space simulator developed by German-based Rockfish Games and originally launched on Kickstarter in 2015. The game officially released in May 2017, and as part of launching our website, I wrote a review for the game, calling contrast, much like it is in the gaming industry, a central theme of EVERSPACE, the contrast of tranquility and terror, triumph and crushing defeat, and players knowing when to stand and fight, and when to turn tail and run. Rockfish Games' roots lie in mobile gaming, where co-founders Michael Schade and Christian Lohr originally started Fish Lab Games in 2002 and developed quite the number of titles, including the Galaxy on Fire series, the studio's most well-known series and clear inspiration behind EVERSPACE. As is becoming more and more common in today's gaming industry, Schade and Lohr left Fish Labs, created Rockfish, launched a crowdfunding campaign, and EVERSPACE has become another glowing example of crowdfunding's virtues. Now, a little less than a year after I wrote my initial review, EVERSPACE released its first piece of DLC in late 2017, and I've also had the opportunity to play the game in VR. These new additions only solidified my opinion that EVERSPACE is an absolute triumph of game design and gameplay, mixing the best elements of a roguelike with the mystery and peril of deep space combat and exploration. EVERSPACE is all about decision-making and risk-taking, from picking between the 4 distinct ships, to picking where to jump next, how long to stay, where to allocate resources. The game constantly puts players in positions of long and short-term decision-making. In recognizable fashion, EVERSPACE has players jump between points in space. These semi-open box-shaped levels house traders, the next step in a mission, and harbor all kinds of danger. And usually the more dangerous an area, the bigger the spoils. Players need fuel in order to continue their journey, and they can't stay too long in any one area before enemies show up to chase them off. The jump routes players follow are predetermined, and while the map gives a general idea of what to expect, it never tells players outright. There's a nice level of planning here, of deciding whether or not to risk going through a system with an environmental warning to get to the trader and the next system. Also within these areas lie EVERSPACE's 3 types of resources: credits, nanobots, and an assortment of crafting materials. Credits are the only resource that carry over from life to life, used to buffer a ship's base stats or purchase in-game material from traders, while crafting materials and nanobots are used in ship repairs and in-game upgrades, and are lost when players die. This forces players to balance in-game upgrades giving short-term benefits with upgrades that will carry from life to life, thus giving more long-term benefits. Using credits, you can purchase materials from traders to, say, make a weapon deal more damage, but those credits won't be around when you're able to upgrade ships or pilot abilities in between lives. So personally, I hoard credits. I don't spend them on materials at all, and if a run is going well and my survival comes down to material I desperately need, I'll let a run end in favor of utilizing my credits for long-term upgrades. And it's such a satisfying and somewhat strange feeling following disappointing defeat, knowing the next thing I can do is nab that upgrade I've had my eyes on for hours. All ships have primary and secondary weapon slots in categories for devices, things like shield generators and other ship abilities, and consumables, which include damage boosters or even drones that'll defend your ship. Just about everything you do requires some amount of power, EVERSPACE's version of stamina, and each ship has and consumes different levels of power. While pilot upgrades translate from ship to ship, each ship is upgraded separately, meaning players can pour all their credits into one ship, and thus one playstyle, or distribute their credits amongst all 4 ships. First up, we'll be talking about the Colonial Interceptor, the workhorse of the EVERSPACE fleet. By its own description, its disadvantages are small, but it also doesn't excel in any one spot. With 450 base hull points, 10% armor accounting to 10% damage reduction, and a boost speed of 300 meters per second, the Interceptor can go toe-to-toe with EVERSPACE's toughest enemies while having this speed for a quick getaway, if the pilot needs it. Being unspecialized, it's a great spacecraft for new players or players who appreciate its balance of fight and flight. For the Colonial Scout, speed is the name of the game. Visually similar to a TIE fighter, the Scout is small, maneuverable, and extremely fast. Just don't get caught with your shields down in a fight. 250 hit points means direct hits are deadly, and at higher speed, smashing into an asteroid you didn't see usually means a run is cut short. But what the Scout lacks in combat, it makes up for in cunning, as it's the only ship able to use cloaking devices and teleporters, tools perfect for a quick getaway, or a deadly ambush. The Gunship is a semi-truck strapped with armor and rocket boosters. While it's unable to equip a shield, its base hit points start at 1090 and armor an impressive 35%. It's also the only ship that can use turrets, which, when taken into account with its molasses-like maneuvering, completely changes dogfighting. All primary weapons in EVERSPACE have a rather wide firing cone, fairly standard for games where you fly things that shoot other things. But the Gunship's turrets mean players get a secondary cone above the ship, so not only is it important to keep enemies in front of you, but you'll need to keep them in front of you and above you if you plan on using the turret. The Sentinel was introduced with the Encounters DLC in a sort of an interceptor and scout hybrid. With 300 whole hit points and a boost speed of 388 meters per second, it's stronger than the Scout and faster than the Interceptor, while conversely trumping neither. Most importantly, the Sentinel has only one primary weapon slot, emphasizing its expanded catalog of devices and consumables. As common in video game parlance, EVERSPACE's weapons tend to do either shield or hull damage, and switching between one of each is usually the go-to tactic. But with the Sentinel, primary weapons take a backseat to the ship abilities, making devices like the shield disruptor not only more important, but complement weapon choice. Combat in EVERSPACE is a fantastic blend of ship upgrades and weapons with player skill, and learning how to move and fight in EVERSPACE is just a phenomenal experience. Flying in EVERSPACE is different than most space games. It's less like flying an airplane and more like flying a helicopter. Take the slow-moving projectiles of a bullet hell or shmup mixed with some traditional video game spacefight mechanics, and you get EVERSPACE. Strafing left, right, up, and down is just as important as moving forward and backward. All ships relatively turn on a dime, which means enemies won't have trouble tracking and finding you. You'll be facing and trading fire with enemies far more often than staying on an enemy's tail. And not all projectiles are slow moving, some reach their target almost instantly. It's a matter of learning what enemies fire what projectiles and how best to avoid them. This is also where boosting comes in. While there to help take away time from crossing some of the game's more spread out areas, boosting provides quick lateral and horizontal dodges perfect for escaping slower moving dangers like rockets and missiles. And this is all to the pilot's discretion. There's no textbook in the game that details how best to evade certain attacks. As an example, take this fight with an Okar frigate, one of the game's tougher enemies. Okar frigates have two hard-hitting weapons, quick-firing laser turrets and slow-charging energy coils. The laser turrets aren't too tough to dodge on their own as long as players don't fly in one direction for too long and don't get too close. But the frigate's energy coils force players to quickly change positions, switching their posture from attacking to evading and opening them up to attack from the laser turrets. The only way to learn how to defeat the frigate is quite literally on the fly, and that's great. It's organic, and it's all made more intense because players only have one life before they have to start over. If players have the option to throw on a headset and play in VR, they'll find combat and flight becomes much harder, though no less exciting. Because the player's perspective is locked to the cockpit in VR, spatial awareness becomes even more important. Tracking targets is harder, and there's no indication of nearby debris or asteroids. Flying through dense areas, let alone fighting in them, becomes a much slower, much more deliberate action. VR's biggest downside, however, is EVERSPACE's rough optimization. Stuttering and framerate issues made me turn the fidelity down quite a bit, but never to a point where I couldn't play the game. Flying through EVERSPACE's gorgeous asteroid fields and derelict ships in VR really is an experience unlike any other, but I do prefer the game without the headset. And by the way, as you've probably noticed, EVERSPACE is beyond gorgeous, whether lasers are flying or you're on your own on the edge of some distant solar system. The lighting effects are stunning, it's incredibly colorful, and really a bit of an issue for those of us who suffer from screenshot addiction. EVERSPACE's main storyline, while not magnificent, is simple, fun, and enough to be appreciated. It's not too complicated, and that's a good thing. Because EVERSPACE is a roguelike, players can go hours between story sequences, as they don't replay through every life. Encounters adds new characters with different and distinct personalities, some of which are really intriguing. Players picking up the game in DLC for the first time will have tons of stuff to find and new missions to complete, while players who have already poured a few hours into the game will have new reasons to brave the game's dangers. The writing is really solid, especially for a genre that really isn't known for that, and the entire game, from the way characters are illustrated and talk to the design of ships, emanates a nostalgic 90s sci-fi feel to it. Here's a bit of the ambient music, see if it reminds you of anything. EVERSPACE puts off this vibe of a game made by people who just had a cool idea. It feels like one of those speculative games you discuss with friends, saying, what if this did that, and wouldn't it be cool if a game did this? EVERSPACE continues to surprise me, continues to blow me away with just how gorgeous it is, and how exhilarating the dogfighting can be. The game can feel repetitive at times, though I think some of that is due to the nature of its genre. And after having it installed for a few years, I've put more hours into it than I'm comfortable discussing here. It's a great game with enough depth to keep me interested, while not being so complicated that I can't jump in after a few months of not playing. With their first entry into PC and console gaming, Rockfish Games hit a home run, a brilliant piece of gameplay and design that oozes personality and passion, and it makes me really excited to see where they go from here.